Hi, I'm Jayne Waldrop, and I'm really happy to be with you here tonight at the McCracken County Public Library to talk about Mayfield as common ground between two really significant artists, Ellis Wilson and Helen LaFrance. And so I want to talk about Mayfield as the setting, the art of each of these just wonderful, outstanding artists, and to know a little bit about their lives and their journeys in becoming artists. We will have time for questions afterwards, so I'm happy to take your questions. Ellis Wilson and Helen LaFrance were two acclaimed American artists, and both were born and raised in or near Mayfield in Graves County, about a generation apart. He was born in 1899. She was born in 1919. He headed north as part of the Great Migration in order to attend art school. I'm not sure they knew each other or ever met each other. That would be an interesting question. I don't have the answer for it yet, but I think I have now some contacts to have that conversation with. But together, they put Mayfield on the map for being the home of two extraordinary creative spirits. Tonight, I'd like to talk about both artists as well as Mayfield and Graves County, and as this place that inspired them to become artists. I was fortunate to meet Helen LaFrance in about 1999 when she had a small gallery and studio in Mayfield. My late father-in-law, Ralph Waldrop, introduced me to Helen. They were about the same age and were friends for decades. They both shared the fact that they had lived in Graves County or Mayfield all of their lives. He loved her art, and he was really excited to introduce me to Helen and for me to have the opportunity to see her artwork. I later curated a retrospective exhibit of her artwork at the Janice Mason Art Museum in Cadiz. And I interviewed her for a story in Kentucky Monthly magazine. From these personal connections and hearing her story about learning to draw and to paint when she was a child, I decided her life and art might make an interesting subject for a children's picture book. She Remembered It All, The Art of Memory Painter Helen LaFrance was published earlier this year by Shadeland House Modern Press. I didn't learn about Ellis Wilson until about 2007, when I watched a documentary about his life on Kentucky Educational Television. My first response to learning about this fellow Western Kentuckian and his groundbreaking art was to think, how did I not know about him? His name had not been mentioned in my modern art history classes at the University of Kentucky when I was an undergraduate. His name was not mentioned in textbooks. There was no bronze historical marker in Mayfield noting his connection to that town. He died in 1977, so it was too late to meet him in person. So I began to research his life and his work. Through the documentary work of KET and a book spearheaded by Albert Spirith, former director of the Clara M. Eagle Gallery at Murray State University, I learned that Ellis Wilson's personal papers are archived at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. After contacting the Smithsonian, I learned that the papers were available on microfiche and could be borrowed through a local library. So I borrowed them through the University of Kentucky Library. We were living in Lexington at the time. I spent several days reading and copying the collection. I also read interviews that he gave, particularly one with Camille Billups in 1975, not long before he died, in which he too mentioned that he knew from childhood that he wanted to be an artist. My book, A Journey in Color, The Art of Ellis Wilson, was published in 2022, also by Shadeland House Modern Press. Both picture books are illustrated by Nashville artist Michael McBride. Although they were born about a generation apart, Ellis Wilson and Helen LaFrance shared some common themes and traits. Both grew up during the Jim Crow era of prescribed and enforced segregation, which between 1876 and 1965 significantly limited the social, economic, and educational conditions for African Americans in the United States. Mayfield was like much of America, especially in the South, and segregation affected all parts of life, including schooling, with the myth of separate but equal educational opportunities, housing, voting, employment, travel, and nearly all personal relationships. Both Wilson and LaFrance primarily painted scenes of Black American life, both urban and rural, from Graves County and Chicago to New York City and Haiti. They both painted downtown scenes, whether that was in Mayfield or Manhattan. Collectively, they painted working people in various jobs, from tobacco fields and cotton fields to wartime airplane factories to coastal fishermen along the Sea Island coast. They studied the details of daily life to accurately and respectfully portray individuals and families. Each painted landscapes undoubtedly influenced by the Western Kentucky landscape and countryside. They revealed a strong sense of place in their art. Each painted poignant scenes of funerals. I'm going to go back one. This is the funeral procession by Ellis Wilson, his most famous painting. Going Home was the name Helen LaFrance gave her graveyard painting. Both also painted the legendary Waldrop monuments in Mayfield, often dubbed the strange procession which never moves. The monuments were erected in the 1890s by Henry Waldrop, the only person actually buried there. Wilson once remarked that the monuments, quote, scared the britches off of him as a child, but they also fascinated him. He painted the scene in 1939 during a visit back to Kentucky. They painted Black lives during an era when African Americans were rarely depicted in art. Yet their artwork isn't about the pain or despair of the Jim Crow era. Their paintings depict rich views of life in the African American community. They captured the celebrations and habits of being alive during this era, and they portrayed their Black subjects with respect as they went about everyday life. This is Ellis Wilson's painting of tobacco farmers. And that's Helen LaFrance's tobacco farms. He left, she stayed. She captured rural life, her own experience of growing up on a farm and remaining in Mayfield. He was drawn to city life. After all, he had grown up in the Mayfield city limits. He later admitted that he had worked hard to delete the country sound from his accent. He never again lived in a rural area, although he too painted rural life in exotic locations like Haiti and the Sea Islands. So let's look at Mayfield and Graves County as the place where both were born. That's one of his paintings from Haiti, working people. And this is a kitchen scene of Helen LaFrance's. Ellis Wilson lived in Mayfield until young adulthood, when he left for college, the first in his family. He returned fairly regularly to visit his family, especially while his mother was still alive, which I think was until the late 1960s. But he never came back to live here. She never left, and her memory paintings captured daily life and special events like church picnics and river baptisms. She seemed to document past and present as the world changed around her. Mayfield is the center of the Jackson Purchase, which includes the 8 westernmost counties in Kentucky. This land became part of the United States in a deal negotiated with the Chickasaw Nation in 1818. Graves County was formally organized in 1823, and Mayfield became the county seat. Mayfield was an industrious place. The completion of the Memphis, New Orleans, and Northern Railroad in 1858 connected Mayfield with the outside world and formed the basis of the town's growth. Mayfield Woolen Mills was founded in 1860, and the manufacture of clothing became the main industry in Mayfield for the next 100 years. The town was also a major market for loose-leaf tobacco. Both industries became major employers in the region. During the Civil War, much of western Kentucky, including Mayfield, strongly supported the Confederate cause. Historian Barry Craig has called Graves County Kentucky's South Carolina, an allusion to a secessionist movement that originated at the Graves County Courthouse. On May 29, 1861, a group of Southern sympathizers from Kentucky and Tennessee met at the Graves County Courthouse to discuss the possibility of seceding from Kentucky to become part of Tennessee, which had already joined the Confederate States of America. Surviving records show that the convention adopted resolutions condemning President Abraham Lincoln for waging a bloody and cruel war against the South, urging Governor Magoffin to resist Union forces and praising him for refusing to answer Lincoln's demand for soldiers. During and after the Reconstruction period, there was a lot of growth in Mayfield and in Graves County. There was also considerable white violence against black residents of Graves County. In 1 week in late December 1896, just 3 years before Ellis Wilson was born, 4 black men were lynched in Mayfield. Because one of the men was a successful and well-respected black businessman, white residents began to fear retaliation. They called for like-minded reinforcements from Fulton County, and the violence escalated. A young black man was shot and killed as he got off the train in Mayfield. Then a large white mob killed 2 more African American men and burned the homes of 4 black families. This episode of extreme violence finally ended, but institutionalized segregation existed under the law for another 7 decades, including during the lives of Ellis Wilson and Helen LaFrance. Ellis was born in 1899 in the segregated neighborhood known as the Bottom. These are the 4 neighborhoods in Mayfield that were segregated neighborhoods. He was one of 6 children of Frank and Minnie Wilson. His father was a barber and ran a successful barbershop business in Mayfield, and his mother worked as a maid for white households. His father was also an amateur painter. In a 1975 interview, Ellis said he believed that he got his artistic talent from his father. 2 of Frank Wilson's paintings hung in the barbershop during Ellis Wilson's childhood. While still very young, Ellis took odd jobs to help out his family. He worked in tobacco and also as a janitor and delivery boy for a downtown dress shop known as Days Ready to Wear. He once drew a portrait in cleaning soap as he cleaned the front windows. And this portrait that he drew attracted the interest of passers-by. The delighted store owner encouraged him to draw new storefront art each week. This is the Wilson family home in the bottom. His formal education began at Mayfield Colored Grade School and later at Dunbar High School. In the same 1975 interview, Wilson said this about growing up in Mayfield. "I have always been rather glad that I did grow up there, as long as I got out when I did. It was a very leisurely, normal growing up as one could have. You knew everybody." After he graduated from, and this is the Second Christian Church in Mayfield, which still stands today. His mother, Minnie, was one of the founders of this church, and he called it, Ellis Wilson called it Miss Minnie's Church, always, throughout his life. After he graduated from high school, he attended Kentucky Normal and Industrial Institute in Frankfort for 2 years. The historically black college is now known as Kentucky State University. At that school, at that time, students could only study agriculture or education to prepare to become a farmer or a school teacher. There were no art classes offered, and Ellis wanted to study art. At age 19, he left for Kentucky. He left Kentucky for Chicago to attend the Art Institute of Chicago, which, as you can tell, this was about the time that he was there. If you've seen that building lately, you know that this was when it must have been brand new in that part of town, in that part of the city. Ellis loved his time at the Art Institute. He flourished in his classes and became involved with the Chicago Art League, where he met other aspiring artists. He worked various jobs in the summer to help pay his $150 per year tuition. One of the things I've always been amazed about, and I include a section in the book about this, is that how different this must have felt from coming from the bottom neighborhood in Mayfield to arriving in Chicago. He completed his Art Institute studies in 1923 and stayed in Chicago for 5 years trying to make a living as a commercial artist. In 1928, he moved on. This is a great quote. "The Art Institute and the museum are all in one. You could go through the galleries at will, and it was exciting. I thought I was in Paris. There were hundreds of white students, and among them, I think, were 3 or 4 Negroes." In 1928, and this is an example of the sort of classical art instruction that he received at the Art Institute. It was a very academic style education. A lot of live models and still life set up in the studios. This shows a lot of his work as a graphic artist. He tried to make a living as a graphic artist in Chicago. And then he arrived in Harlem. He arrived during a particularly vital time of artistic and cultural creativity that became known as the Harlem Renaissance. He later moved and lived in Greenwich Village. He said he liked being there because he was surrounded by artists. At the time he arrived in New York, black artists were still barred from most mainstream galleries. The new Negro art movement grew out of a cooperative effort to promote and exhibit the work of African American artists. Ellis's work was included in many of the exhibitions and events associated with the movement, including those sponsored by the Harmon Foundation. The opportunities that the Harmon Foundation and the grants that they provided helped a lot of black artists survive during those years. Just as the opportunities seemed to open up for black artists, this is one of his paintings from that time period. Again, people doing work. That was a common theme in his work. Just as the opportunities seemed to open for Black artists, the hardships of the Great Depression hit, meaning and meant that making a living as an artist became even more difficult. From 1935 to 1940, he was employed by the government's Works Progress Administration federal arts projects, which gave jobs to artists and gave them a steady but small income. Through the WPA, he made a living and befriended other artists. In an interview, he said, "We made very little money, but things at that time, food and clothes, cost very little. Rent was very cheap. I was paying $18 a month for a cold water place. It was a joy," he remembered. They were all painting and visiting and talking and drinking wine, but it was really stimulating. It really got me to painting on my own. It was beautiful. It was during this time that he broke away from the academic style of painting he had learned at the Art Institute. These are some of the triptychs that he did during World War II. He said, "I just cut out completely from anything that looked like a portrait. It was freer. I was astounded. I just hit upon something." In 1939, he began applying each year for a Guggenheim Fellowship, thinking that he would be able to travel and paint. He had conceived a project of traveling throughout the South and painting Black people at work. The words from his successive Guggenheim applications were profound in expressing his determination to paint. I included quotes from these applications in my book because it was the way to authentically include Ellis Wilson's voice. In 1939, his Guggenheim application said this: "Practically all of my life I have been painting under difficult conditions. Lack of time and lack of money and time, especially time, have prevented me from painting as much and as often as I have wanted to. I have made steady progress until now. My work has reached a mature stage, and I feel that with a grant such as the Guggenheim, giving the opportunity and encouragement to wholly concentrate on painting, I could express myself to the fullest degree and accomplish worthwhile work. In short, I want to paint all the time, everything of interest and beauty." He also wrote in that application, "I am most interested in painting the Negro. Unfortunately, this type of painting hasn't a large following at present. I am desirous of both making a name for myself in the art world and to create paintings which will be a credit to my race and my time." 1940, he didn't get the fellowship that year. In 1940, he applied again. "I'm striving with each canvas to paint the Negro with greater feeling and understanding. There is such a wide, rich field of unexplored material to work from. Although I have been painting the Negro for a number of years, I feel I have only begun to go beneath the surface." He didn't receive the award that year. In 1941, "My project or plan doesn't take much telling. It seems a little more impatient with this application. My life is dedicated to painting, and what is more, to painting the Negro. There is so much to paint and so little time." The KET documentary that I mentioned previously took its name from this quote. It's called "So Much to Paint," and you can find it on the KET website still. In 1944, his persistence finally paid off. He was awarded the Guggenheim Fellowship, and he was one of the first African American artists to be awarded it. He also received the award for 1945. The award supported travel to the Sea Islands of Georgia and South Carolina, where he painted African Americans in work and family settings. In 1952, he won the $3,000 Terry Prize for a painting he had produced during his Guggenheim travels. With the Terry Award, he traveled to Haiti, where he experienced a country where blacks were the ruling majority. This really excited him and surprised him. His quote is, "Although they were black, I couldn't understand them. They all spoke Creole and French. All that excited me," he recalled. And then it was tropical. I'd never seen a tropical place before. And with the music, the drumming, the dancing, they were very artistic. His style of painting really shifted during this time. He returned to Haiti several times. As his style shifted and matured, it seemed to vibrate with vivid color and streamlined geometric shapes. He was then at the peak of his creative powers. This is a piece that Murray State University owns. It's one of my favorites. It's so vivid. And back home, he was starting to be recognized for his art. Newspapers like the Courier-Journal and the Mayfield Messenger wrote stories about his work. Ellis clipped the articles and saved them, along with exhibit programs, telegrams about his awards, and letters about museum purchases. These pieces are all included in the Smithsonian Archive. Ellis Wilson made frequent trips back to Mayfield to visit family and friends. In 1947, the still segregated Mayfield Public Library opened its doors to the community for an exhibit of his work. In his interview with Camille Billups, Ellis said this was the first art exhibit ever held in Mayfield. Hundreds of citizens attended, and the artist himself considered it one of the high points of his life. A clipping from the Mayfield News Graphic reported, "About 30 years ago, a little Negro boy used to deliver packages for the old St. Day ready-to-wear store. Now that little boy is back in his hometown with an exhibit of his paintings. He is Ellis Wilson." A year later, in 1948, the J.B. Speed Art Museum in Louisville held a solo exhibit of Wilson's work. In 1950, Murray State College, now university, purchased 2 paintings, an effort spearheaded by then art professor Clara M. Eagle. In 1952, Murray State organized an exhibit of his work at a time when black students could not be admitted to the college. In the 1980s, the popular TV comedy, The Cosby Show, featured an episode based on an auction, an art auction, in which Claire Huxtable of the Huxtable family was determined to buy her Uncle Ellis's painting, The Funeral Procession. And for the rest of the time of that show, while it was on air, the funeral procession, a copy of the funeral procession, hung over the fireplace in the living room. To mark the centennial of his birth and in conjunction with the KET documentary, a major retrospective exhibit of Ellis Wilson's work was organized by Albert Spirith, who spent several years tracking down works that were often undated and sometimes referred to by several different titles. In 2000, the exhibit was shown at Murray State's Clara M. Eagle Gallery and the University of Kentucky Art Museum. University Press of Kentucky published the exhibit catalog as The Art of Ellis Wilson, which has served as a great source of information for preserving Ellis Wilson's legacy. In his own time, though, Ellis never quite managed to make a living at painting. No black artist of his time did. He worked as a museum guard, a handyman, and a courier. When he died in 1977, he was buried in an unmarked pauper's grave in New York. And you can see how simplified the shapes and colors are. And this was in Haiti. And these are some of the clippings that are included in his archives. They were really interesting to read because, he had selected these pieces to keep and to save. There's the Mayfield Messenger. That one was painted with the Guggenheim Fellowship money too, as he traveled in the Sea Islands. And this is a great letter. If you want to look at it later, I don't know that you can read it. It's kind of small print, but it's the letter from Clara Eagle thanking him for giving Murray State a break on the price when they purchased that painting. And there's the funeral procession there above the mantle. And that's one of his self-portraits. So now we're going to move on to Helen LaFrance. Helen LaFrance Orr was born in 1919 in Graves County, the second of 4 daughters. Her parents were James Franklin Orr and Lily Mae Orr, known to their friends as Bud and Hun. They were farmers who owned their own land. They grew tobacco and corn. Helen lived her long life within 10 miles of where she was born. She attended school for just a few years. Her parents continued her education at home, instructing her in reading and math, and her mother taught her to paint, guiding her hand and helping her mix colors made from dandelions, berries, and Bluette laundry detergent. She and her sisters worked in the family fields. Helen drew after her chores were done. In an interview, she recalled that she loved the smell of crayons that her mother would bring her. As an adult, she worked in tobacco, in a hospital, as a cook, as a photo retoucher in a photography studio, and she painted custom whiskey decanters at a local ceramics factory. As a self-taught artist working outside the mainstream art market and without formal training, her work has been compared to the art of Grandma Moses, Horace Pippin, and Clementine Hunter. These artists who are self-taught and outside formal academic training are often known as outsider artists, especially for artists like Helen, who created her own pigments, worked with found objects, so that is part of her legacy, that outsider status. Her memory paintings document rural life in Western Kentucky. She always created art, regardless of what her paid job was to do. She worked as a painter, a wood carver, a doll maker, a muralist, and a quilter. In the 1980s, she started selling her work to neighbors at local art shows and fairs. For a time, she repurposed an old school bus into her art studio, which was parked on her property. She later moved into town, where she rented studio and gallery space in Mayfield. She was a soft-spoken and modest woman. About her memory paintings, she said that painting was her way of going home. This is one of my favorite pieces because, if you know Graves County very well, it's a very flat place. And this is though she is up on a mountain or up, she's getting a bird's eye view of these fields, this patchwork of fields. And I think that's a real testament to her imagination and her style of painting. In 2011, she received the Kentucky Governor's Award for Folk Art Heritage during a ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda in Frankfort. Her art is in the permanent collections of several museums. And I did want to mention this. You know, this is a photograph, but she captured urban life too in a lot of her paintings. So we always think of the church picnic paintings and other farm scenes, but she did urban life too. And a racetrack. There's the Waldrop Monument. Her art is in the permanent collections of several museums, including the St. Louis Art Museum, the Owensboro Museum of Fine Art, and the Kentucky Folk Art Museum, as well as in private collections of celebrities like Oprah Winfrey and Bryant Gumbel. This is one of her murals, and this mural is in St. James AME Church in Mayfield, which miraculously, the mural survived the tornado. Most of that church, most of the walls of that church collapsed, but the wall that her painting was on stood through the whole thing. They quickly put tarps over it to preserve it and saved it. And so it is still in the church, and the church has been rebuilt. I'm not sure if they're finished yet. I think it's really close. And this is one of her paintings of a tornado, which to me is an interesting, almost prophetic kind of view. And there she is at the Governor's Awards in the Arts. Helen LaFrance died in 2020 at the age of 101. In the summer of 2024, a large collection of her paintings was scheduled to be auctioned. In an effort to keep as much of the collection together and to stay in Western Kentucky, the Paducah Historical Preservation Association and many tireless volunteers organized a fundraising effort to purchase as many of the pieces as possible. More than a dozen paintings were purchased and are now exhibited at the Paducah School of Art and Design. There are plans to continue to add to this collection so that the Helen LaFrance collection will grow with time. And these are the two books. As I said, children's picture books. And this is just the first page of the Ellis Wilson book, because he did see his father's paintings and he was inspired from childhood. That was the connection to become a children's picture book. And also that's to represent Helen's little girl hands as her mother guided her to teach her how to draw. Okay, well, I want to thank you so much for coming tonight.